Hello and welcome to today's episode of Pod in My Backyard, the podcast for those of us who want to solve the housing crisis. I am joined today by a YIMBY celebrity. He is a housing campaigner, but famously he ran against Rishi Sunak at the last election. So he's going to have stories to tell about Rishi and Rishi's failure to build enough homes for however long the Tories were in power. So welcome. Today I'm joined by Tom Wilson. Hello, Tom.
Hello, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you for coming. So we're kicking off by a question. Which city stood in for Metropolis in Superman 4, The Quest for Peace? Which UK city stood in for Metropolis? UK city.
Oh, God. I mean, it's very vertical in Superman, isn't it? So there's...
I don't know, Tom. Unsurprisingly, I've not seen Superman 4.
You're telling me you haven't seen Superman 4?
I know. Imagine that.
No, me neither. I imagine London would be too obvious.
This is excellent acting for somebody who heard this before we started recording the pod. So, unsurprisingly, it is Milton Keynes. Woo, woo, woo. Now, Milton Keynes has become popular in Labour circles recently because we all love new towns these days. So today, kicking off with Tom to talk about the new proposals to build some new towns, some urban extensions, and how that's all going to work.
So the New Towns Task Force has put out a public consultation to inform its thinking about where to place 12 new towns across the country. Many people will have grown up in a new town. Milton Keynes, as already discussed, is one of the highlight ones. Peterborough is a new town. They're pocketed all over the country, and a big part of the government's housing proposals to try and get to 1.5 million is to build 12 new towns with 10,000 homes in each. I've been working on a report related to the New Towns Task Force consultation, not just proposing 12 sites based on a range of criteria, economic growth potential, transport, all these kind of things. We've also brought in public polling, which I think is unique in terms of the responses to the consultation,
Cool.
To figure out where do local people support the building of a new town near them.
And where do people support the building of a new town near them?
So, as listeners may not be surprised to know from the opening of this pod,
The Green Belt.
The Milton Keynes comes out number one. The population of Milton Keynes dead keen on new towns, but
Why?
I think Milton Keynes must stand out. It was picked out specifically as a location in the original New Towns proposals that led to Milton Keynes as equidistant between Oxford and Cambridge and equidistant-ish between Birmingham and London. So it was very much a location choice. It's part of the Oxcam arc and the transport links between the two cities. And it's easily accessed from London itself. So it's kind of a perfect spot for that kind of commuter belt around London, around Birmingham, and is now a thriving town in and of itself. And it really runs in the blood of Milton Keynes to build regularly, build high numbers of houses every year on year, and the population just... love new towns. They want to have an extension. They want to have a new town near them. It's by far and away the most popular part of the UK to have a new town by the local people. But there are plenty of others. We identified more than 12 actually sites where more than 50% of the population actually support a new town or an urban extension where they live. So the second in the list was Leeds, around the Leeds-York corridor.
Yeah.
And then various places that circle London, Northumberland, in the southwest. There's a whole bunch of places where the economics works, the transport works, and there is more than 50% support.
Where is there not 50% support?
I think we had a short list of 30 places, and you tick under 50% after about 15.
Okay.
So there's actually some places where it's popular to build a new town that didn't quite make our list because of the other factors we looked at. But if you build 12 new towns with 10,000 each, that's 120,000 homes. That's a big leap towards the housing target that the government set. But additionally to that, it's a huge opportunity to invest in infrastructure, local services, and to relieve the housing crisis in the cities that these new towns and urban extensions will surround, as it will become possible to commute via train easily into London, into Manchester, into Newcastle. And you are therefore expanding the supply of houses in those cities for the people who want to work in those economic zones. So it's a huge opportunity. And it is unusually, I think, given the scale of new towns, it's unusually popular with the public. There's this impression that new towns are a holistic way of planning where to build houses, where some would be uncomfortable with a large number of houses and no extra services being built near them. People are a lot more open to the idea of a bigger number of houses being built near them if the services and the transport links have been considered as part of that package.
Yeah, I'm wondering if what this is telling us is that a lot of the people who are anti-new housing are anti-new housing because there's that feeling that everything's under strain, everything's overpopulated, there are too many people, there are not enough services, everything's a scramble for what people need, and people push back on that and say, no, we don't want new people coming in. When you talk about building new infrastructure, building new schools, GP surgeries, etc., new public places, new businesses, all of that kind of stuff, there's a bit of an attitude of, yeah, we want the UK to get better, we want it to be good, we just don't want it to be this zero-sum game where if somebody else gains a new home here, we lose out. Is that what's going on there, you think?
I think it's exactly what's going on. The housing debate is quite often a bit of a proxy war for other issues. So people not being able to see their GP quickly enough, or not being happy with the service, people not being having to live further and further away from their child's school, which is full with class sizes of 35 in some cases.
Not in the inner city, guys.
Not in the inner city. But across the country, there is a demand for public services that are seen as falling apart. And when housing is built in lockstep with those goals, and it's made very you tie the building of housing to the improvement of services, it's very popular compared to the public perception of how popular new local housing is to locals. I think the stereotype of the sort of NIMBY group who are very, very loud and turn up to all the planning meetings and councils and become the number one responders by miles when any new housing gets proposed is not actually where most voters are. And where what most voters want is more housing. They want their children to be able to live near them. They don't want to have adult children into their 30s living with them because they can't afford to move out. But they do probably want them locally. Certainly with those older relatives, you're going to need your children or your children's children living reasonably close to you in case you need to be cared for. And so people want houses built. They just don't want their services strained. And there's a lot of misconceptions about how new housing affects their local services. But the great thing about new towns is that you aren't just building houses that the local people are not going to buy themselves as they're sorted. You are building communities and you're extending communities, and people can feel involved in that process.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting because I think on this podcast, we talk a lot about NIMBYs, obviously. And there are, I guess, some classic NIMBY categories, if you like. You've got those who ultimately say it's about, I don't know, new welfare or whatever, but what's actually going on is they own quite a nice house that's rising in value whilst there's a housing shortage, and they don't want their asset to not be as valuable as it would be otherwise. And you have that just very clear, this is in people's economic interests. There might be a veneer of it's about some issue, but it's very clear advancement of personal economic interests to the detriment of other people who, you know, should have a human right to housing. And we see that going on. Then we also see the kind of neighbourhood defender type, don't want change, anxious about change. In some inner city areas, is change bringing in more and more inequality? We talk about gentrification, new build flats attracting wealthier people, people being forced out by our overwhelming housing shortages in our cities. And that's very much a kind of protect your neighbourhood, keep it as it is, kind of a conservatism, but a conservatism with I guess, a push towards a desire, at least, for social equality and accessible housing for all, just not actually getting there. Is this a different kind of attitude to housing we're seeing with the new towns?
I think it is. I mean, the classic sort of NIMBY archetypes I think they are still quite rare. They're very loud and very obnoxious and very easy to mock and very fun to mock. And I participate myself.
And to be fair, on the gentrification point,
Yeah.
I have great sympathy with that argument. I just think that gentrification is about the failure to build enough social housing, the hollowing out of our social housing, and that's why we've got to that point. And so that the thing that people are arguing against is not actually the cause of the problem.
Yeah. I mean, on the value of your own house and not wanting to devalue your house by blocking building near you. What I found interesting actually as part of the experience of campaigning in the general election in Richmond and Northallerton, which is
Tom's a celeb, by the way,
very
guys.
Some rooms.
It's a celeb to me.
Some YIMBYs know who I am. That's what's happening. But in Richmond and Northallerton, and the whole of North Yorkshire, it's a very leafy part of the world. There's some real wealth pockets in there, just as much as there's pockets of poverty. And it is not in your interest, especially if you live in a really rural place, even if you are in £1 million house, £2 million house, whatever. It's not in your interest that your family who live nearby can't see a doctor, or having to go further away from an A&E. One of the big issues in Richmond, actually, in the seat in Northallerton, which is the biggest town in the constituency, is that the hospital had recently lost its A&E, not because of cuts, but because they physically couldn't staff it. And the nearest A&E, people were having to go, some people were having to travel quite far already to get to Northallerton, and were instead having to be diverted to Leeds in West Yorkshire, or into Middlesbrough.
How far is that in a car?
I mean, it's much, much further. We're talking, like for some people, if you're in the really most rural parts of North Yorkshire, you're talking 70, 80 miles, not really.
To a hospital?
To an A&E.
Wow.
And there was the same concern locally about maternity care disappearing because they couldn't staff the maternity ward, which is even, in many cases, that's more serious. And it is not in your interest, if you live in a £2 million house, to live in a £2.2 million house, but where your elderly parents can't get to an A&E. And people really understood the need to be building houses that were affordable for the staff who would be able to...
And talk about the trajectory over time. How has that happened? What's gone on in that area where housing has become so expensive that people doing jobs, reasonably paid jobs. I mean, I think that doctors, nurses, physiotherapists, etc., should be paid better than they are, but these are not people on very low incomes. What's gone on where people doing those kind of jobs have been priced out of living near their work?
Yeah, so I mean, there hasn't been enough building across the board. I think there's been a general trend among younger people to move out from rural areas into cities. Yeah. Just across. So especially those staff who work in A&E, they either have been working for decades in the same place they've lived locally, and they may be renting and struggling with the rising cost of rent. That's an issue in rural areas just as much as it's an issue in cities.
Despite having worked there for decades.
Despite having worked there for decades. Or you are relying on, especially younger, new nurses into the NHS, who are moving to cities. They are not staying in those rural areas anymore. That is partly housing costs. That is partly the social pull of being around people your age. Yeah. And so we need to work even harder in rural places to keep those skilled key workers living locally and willing to spend their career in rural services, which are a lot more strained. And we've seen these kind of sites closing down or losing services. This was the Prime Minister's seat, and they lost an A&E.
Yeah, so, that's crazy. He must not have been worried about that.
Utterly crazy. But you door knock in Northallerton, and people just kept mentioning the cost of housing and the cost of rent and the fact that their children are having to move miles away to Newcastle or to Leeds or Sheffield or wherever. And so people got it. We were in the most conservative part of the country, and it is now the safest conservative seat in the country, if such a thing exists.
Are Reform going to get a look in?
They put a good effort into it at the election, and they came third, despite picking a local veteran from the military base Catterick, which is in the constituency. Okay. I don't know. It's not natural Labour territory at all, so it's very possible if the continued unsuccess of Kemi Badenoch continues, then reform may suddenly get a look in. But people get the need for housing. They really do. And those services are used by your family. They're used by your friends, not just yourself. So like that stereotype, there's a little bit more nuance to it, even in really leafy places, even in really rural places, because the lack of access, the stripping back of bus services, the stripping back of public transport generally, is exacerbating every single problem that those communities face. And so you need to build the houses where those services are, or they're going to close.
Yeah.
And people understood that.
Yeah. I think it's a picture of decline, ultimately decline in every part of the UK, frankly, and in every aspect of life in the UK, pretty much. Certainly decline in our inner cities, decline in the quality of our housing, the affordability of our housing, decline in our employment options, decline. Everything's getting worse. Nothing's getting better. It's kind of the feeling. And I guess that brings me on to talking about some of the areas that were built in the post-war period, where we did have that kind of rush of optimism of building a better society. The war is over, and now how do you build the peace? And that rush of expanding the welfare state, social housing, education, all of the good stuff that we want to see today that makes for a vibrant safety net in a society. The opposite, that period of building, and we're looking for that kind of sense of, I guess, abundant public services accessible to all. Tell us about what has happened to some of that in the areas that you've been campaigning in.
Yeah, so one of the things I was doing during the general election and before it was touring the wider region to really get to grips with some of the issues that we'd be facing in the general election. And one of the places that I campaigned in, Eastfields, which is a big one, exactly as you say, one of these big builds post-World War II, in just outside Scarborough. And it was all social housing. It was clean, crisp, brand new housing for those who planned for those who'd returned from the war. Started building in the 1950s. And it was a really desirable place to live just outside one of the big tourist traps of the time, Scarborough. Scarbados.
As my dad used to call it.
Yeah, as many of us did. I canvassed quite a few times in Eastfields, and it's the kind of place that Labour always used to absolutely dominate in terms of local elections, in terms of the vote in the general elections. Scarborough itself, during the last government, stayed Conservative, and we gained it back with the wonderful Alison Hume in 2024. But even through all of that time, Eastfields was the kind of place that was returning Labour councillors. But what I was seeing and hearing on the doorstep was a community really in pain, really, because people who've lived there, in these kind of builds, people have lived there 40, 50 years sometimes.
Yep.
When they moved there, they were kind of the model of what living could be. You had a generous welfare state. You had really good quality social housing. And what they saw over 50 years of living there was essentially exactly as we were saying, this managed decline, except really not managed.
Yeah.
Pavements cracking and not being replaced, roads bursting open, the houses degrading and not being properly fixed, the introduction of really impactful antisocial behaviour issues, to the point where people were literally in tears to me on the doorstep, not recognising where they lived anymore. And with working class communities, especially in the Northeast, who are now potentially slipping away from the Labour Party, whether to not vote at all because they're done, or to flip to voting for someone like Nigel Farage's Reform Party, what they feel like they've lost and hasn't changed over decades is this decline of their local community that they are fiercely proud of. And they don't recognise the estate anymore. They think crime has essentially been legal because it's not being pursued, or it's not able to be pursued. Mm-hmm. The problems on the estate aren't being fixed. Maybe a bit of patchwork here and there when some money comes into the council, but ultimately the council does not have the budget to be able to deal with these big, deep-seated issues. And this is what everyone in that kind of estate daily experiences like. Leaving the house, seeing the state of where they live, and feeling like nothing is changing, everything's going backwards, even if the growth rate, even under New Labour, was relatively prosperous and delivered certainly better than anything we've seen since. And so one of the big things that I think as a housing campaigner I really want to emphasise, especially to any Labour MPs who may be worried about the threat of reform, is that housing and building is an essential component to beating them back. It is not something that is going to make people open their arms to that kind of populism. Real estate regeneration is such a necessary thing that, so people can feel proud of their own communities again. It's an opportunity to build more houses. We can match up the need to build locally and the kind of private capital that will bring in to do up and fix the estates in which people live. That can be repairs to housing, that can be repairs to roads, repairs to pavements, improving sight lines where there's problems there, improving lighting at night, improving all these little bits and pieces that together, as part of a wider build or a wider project, would make a huge difference but not make a huge impact on the overall cost necessarily. And that is really a tool and a method in which we can start to show people real instant change on the ground, the kind of change that Labour likes to stand for.
So you're talking about basically improving what people in local government call the public realm, making it a nicer place to be physically.
Nicer place to be physically, just a functioning place in some in some cases you've got these estates that were built in the 1940s, 50s, 60s.
So not estate regen in terms of where you knock things down and you rebuild something else.
I mean, in some cases you I've seen plenty of awful instances of mold and rot that's been so baked into a house that there's no choice. Yeah. But in a lot of places, it's this sort of it's this slow degradation where you don't necessarily need to flatten and rebuild. You can build around, you can build in, and you can increase the density in some of these places. But what you really can just do is repair in a lot of instances. And obviously it's going to be a case-by-case basis depending on the estates that you're talking about. I gave just the one example. But where people can feel safe, it isn't just about sprucing it up and giving it a new coat of paint. Like, people feel unsafe in a lot of these communities they remember moving into as a child as being these beacon communities, and they still feel that sense of community. They don't feel that sense reflected back at them. Yeah. And so you deal with the real micro level day-to-day experience issues, the sort of petty crime that doesn't go investigated, the antisocial behavior that scares people from, certainly the older generation, from leaving the house almost. And you improve their lives on a base level through these kind of investments.
Is tackling that kind of decline, and I know I can picture what you're talking about, that kind of feeling that slowly everything's falling apart, nothing's getting repaired, nobody has a sense of kind of responsibility to each other anymore, crime rising, a feeling of you report something to the police and they say, well, what are we going to do about it? That kind of attitude is just tackling how areas physically look enough to stop that.
It's probably not enough, but it's essential part of.
Okay.
The issues on these estates is by now, those people who are engaging in antisocial behaviour, drug dealing, whatever the issue is, whatever they're doing, they know that they are going to get away with it because those are not being investigated. Some parts of the design of some of these council estates, or just housing estates generally, is also making that problem harder to solve. They know the blind spots if there's CCTV that's been installed. Yeah. If the roads are complete trash, if the tarmac is bursting open and potholes that get filled in with cheap stuff, which is often the only option that councils have, cracks open again, if curbs are broken, if people are scared, it becomes a lot easier to sort of dominate that space as a criminal. And so it is an integral part. If you don't deal with those physical space issues, and use the opportunity to build newer, clean, the sort of model of housing that people would remember from 40, 50 years ago, then it becomes really hard to deal. Even if the police suddenly get an uplift of money, even if councils suddenly get an uplift of money, it becomes really hard to deal with
I guess
problems.
what I'm hearing through the things that you're talking about, through the new towns point where you're talking about people really want a whole community built. They don't just want houses, they want a whole community built. The estate regen point and the decline point where people really want to get that sense of community and a place that is physically pleasant to be in back. It's about that, not just the building of new houses. It's about the building of new houses and tackling these problems on a strategic place level, if you like. Is that what you're saying, that one of the ways to tackle the rise of reform and that feeling that, well, everything's getting worse, nothing can be done about it, let's blame someone else for it, to tackle that is to say you need almost like a town by town kind of strategic way of dealing with some of these problems? That includes building the new housing, that includes improving the places that we are, that includes rebuilding our society, really. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, it's absolutely essential, and I don't think you can opt out of it. You know, in the most recent set of local elections, we saw Durham, which was the first place in England to elect Labour representatives, go to reform. The same thing happened in Doncaster.
Why did that happen? Doncaster, my hometown. Woo woo.
So I cut my teeth in the Labour Party campaigning in County Durham, and there are a lot of communities who it's exactly the same story as Eastfields and Scarborough. They have not seen the investment in those towns. Pit villages have not had the jobs replaced since the 1980s when the pits closed. They have got bus routes into the city, but they have become peeled back and so on since the financial crash.
Is it not that people saw a new government coming in, had nearly a year of that, and thought, oh, not sure we want this actually. This guy's promising something that sounds a lot better.
I mean, year on year, there'll be factors like that. Obviously, there is discontent with the direction, if not the direction, the feeling that the government doesn't have control of its agenda, which those can be sorted, and I try and be glass half full about it. But I think you miss the wood for the trees if you don't take the long view as well. And we have been losing support in places like County Durham for a while. Before even 2024, there were lots of local losses on the council level to independent groups. People have been voting Labour in these places that we're talking about for decades and decades and decades, and they haven't seen the change on the ground that they would want to see by voting Labour. And part of that is just decades of governments of different stripes focusing on their own issues and not covering the basic essentials. Councils have been stripped to the bone under the Conservatives, and I'm a truther when it comes to blame everything on Cameron and Osborne. The cutbacks to local councils have been absolutely destructive.
Yeah.
The only thing that some councils are able to do is fund social care and maybe like a civic event.
Yeah, not even a civic event, to be honest. Yeah. Councils bankrupted by social care costs, temporary accommodation costs, transport for disabled children to school, all huge costs that fall on councils they have to do, and then nothing else is left. So what we've seen, really, the hollowing out of local government, huge pressures on local government from social care, temporary accommodation costs, transport for disabled children to school. These are statutory things that local government has to do. And then there being very little money left to do anything else. Yeah.
And all those other things that councils have lost the ability to do are the really essential things for local people, the things that they see every day. They need to keep their streets clean, they need to keep their houses in good shape, they need to deal with antisocial behaviour and crime. If you don't fix those basic essentials, it doesn't matter what the national economy is doing. People will not feel the difference.
Yeah, I saw a great video today of Robert Jenrick having a go at people for skipping fares on the tube because people don't feel a sense of society anymore or whatever. Tories like society now. He was in a government that cut, I think, 778 public libraries. Like, okay, Where are the public places? Where is the sense of community and coming together? Where are the opportunities for people to feel part of society? Oh, they're not there anymore.
Yeah. I grew up under New Labour, and New Labour made really steady progress, a whole bunch of things. Like my school was fallen to bits. It had broken windows.
Yeah, we got a new science department.
And we got an entire rebuild thanks to Gordon Brown's Building Schools for the Future programme. But when you have a government as destructive as the Cameron Osborne one, it can undo so much progress. And if Labour is not banging the drum constantly to see that restored, to get us to a place where we can start to invest in our communities again.
Okay, but why would people say that Labour are going to be the people who do that? Why would Reform not sort that out?
I think the way of looking at the next 4 years is that we don't need people to believe what we say if we can achieve things and prove it to them in the 4 years we've got. People are very disillusioned at the moment. They're very alienated. The government's doing exactly the right thing when it comes to reforming the planning system, getting houses built, because they know that is the route to bringing some shared prosperity. Angela Rayner's workers' rights bill is a purposeful attempt to make sure that the proceeds from that are felt on a wide level.
So shared prosperity felt by everybody. Yes. That's the solution to beating reform.
Yeah. And, if you are a Labour politician, if you're a Labour council and you're worried about reform, and you should be, think about housing as an ally in helping you keep them out. Investment as an ally to helping you keep them out. If we can transform those communities and restore them to what people remember them when they moved in the first place in the 50s, 60s when they were built, if you can make people feel that difference on the ground, there's a lot of interest from developers to build housing. They've seen what the government...
Unsurprisingly, they like building and selling housing.
It is unsurprising. They've taken the government's direction and ran with it. They want to invest. They want to build these communities with you. Don't block them. Work with them. And you can use that as an opportunity to improve some of the communities you've already got.
But build a community, not just build housing.
Absolutely.
Super. Thank you very much for joining me today, Tom. It's been great to have you. And thank you very much, everybody, for listening.